Welcome to the Workflows Functions Guide. In this section, we'll explore functions that help you manage workflow execution and handle errors within Engini. From retrieving details about the current workflow with the workflow function to tracking errors with errors and last error, these functions are essential for smooth workflow management. Let's dive in and see how these tools can enhance your workflow processes. Let's start with the workflow function. This function returns key details about the currently running workflow instance, such as its name, URL, history ID, and workflow ID. It's useful for tracking and managing active workflows. For example, if the currently executing workflow is named Workflow Functions, the workflow function will return the workflow's name, URL, history ID, and workflow ID, providing essential information for monitoring workflow execution. Let's test this by retrieving the details of the current workflow. After running the function, the result is exactly as expected. Let's move on to the errors function. This function returns all workflow errors that have occurred, and you can optionally provide a step number to focus on errors in a specific activity. The output includes details such as the error title, message, activity number, activity name, and the step where the error occurred. For example, if the GetRecords activity from Salesforce contains incorrect details, the errors function will return an array listing the errors that occurred during these steps. Let's test this by retrieving errors from a workflow. After running the function, the result is as expected. Let's move on to the LASTERROR function. This function returns the details of the most recent error that occurred in a workflow, including the error's title, message, activity number, name, and the step where it occurred. For example, let's initialize a new activity such as delete record and input incorrect details. If both the getRecords and delete record activities encounter errors, the LASTERROR function will only return the details of the most recent error, providing essential information for debugging. Let's test this by retrieving the most recent error from the workflow. After running the function, the result is displayed as expected. Let's move on to the LASTERRORMESSAGE function. This function returns the error message from the most recent error that occurred in a workflow, helping you quickly identify the issue. For example, if both the getRecords and delete record activities generate errors, the LASTERRORMESSAGE function will return the message from the last error, allowing you to focus on resolving the most recent problem. Let's test this by retrieving the last error message. After running the function, the message is displayed as expected. Let's move on to the GETUSER function. This function retrieves details about the currently logged in user in AppMaker, including their full name, email, phone number, user ID, and account ID. For example, if the logged in user is Daniel Cohen, the GETUSER function will return his full name, email address, phone number, user ID, and account ID, providing useful information about the current user. Let's test this by retrieving the details of the logged-in user. After running the function, the result is displayed as expected. Let's move on to the ACTIVITYSTATUS function. This function returns the status of a specific activity step in a workflow. The possible values are 0 for not run, 1 for successfully run, 2 for run with error, and 3 for waiting. For example, if you check the status of activity step number 2 using the ACTIVITYSTATUS function, it will return a value of 2 if the activity encountered an error. Let's test this by checking the status of an activity step. After running the function, the result shows an error as expected. Let's move on to the WORKFLOWLASTRUNDATE function. This function returns the timestamp of the last time the workflow was executed. It's useful for tracking when a specific workflow was most recently run. Let's test this by retrieving the last run date of a workflow. After running the function, the result is exactly as expected. Let's finish with the GETWORKFLOWHISTORYID function. This function returns the history ID of the currently running workflow instance, which can be helpful for tracking and logging workflow executions. For example, if the workflow currently running has a history ID, the GETWORKFLOWHISTORYID function will return that ID, allowing you to retrieve important details for workflow management. Let's test this by retrieving the workflow history ID. The result is exactly as expected. That concludes our workflow functions guide. Thanks for following along, and I look forward to seeing you in the next guide. Take care.